The plaque version of this story is short, and it has been told the same way for more than 150 years. A Detroit hardware merchant hears about a legendary copper boulder somewhere up on Lake Superior. He treks north, finds it exactly where the story said it would be, buys it fair and square, and hauls it out of the wilderness through sheer stubborn ingenuity. It's the kind of story a 19th century state fair loved. It's also missing almost everything that actually happened. There is a real report, filed with the Smithsonian's own Board of Regents in the 1890s, that lays out this story in far more detail than the plaque ever bothered with. It names the Ojibwe leader who agreed to the sale and the price he was paid. It names the treaties that had already signed away the ground and the copper sat in, years before that leader ever met the merchant. And it documents, in careful government language, exactly how a piece of native copper, considered a living spirit by the people who had watched over it for generations, ended up seized by the United States Army before it ever left the state. Some of what follows is settled beyond argument. The transaction is on paper. The treaties are on paper. The court fight is on paper. What's still unresolved is a question nobody in that 1890s report was in a position to ask. Who does it actually belong to now? By the end of this, you'll understand why one of the most famous chunks of metal in American history has spent more than a century sitting in a museum case, while the people it was taken from are still, right now, asking for it back. Long before Julius Eldred ever set foot near the Ontonagon River, the copper of Lake Superior had already been known, worked, and passed down for longer than most civilizations on Earth have existed. This is not folklore. It's radiocarbon-dated archaeology, and it's some of the oldest metalworking evidence found anywhere in the world. A recent reanalysis of 53 dated samples, wood, cordage, charcoal, bone, all recovered from mining pits and burial sites around the lake, pushed the origins of what archaeologists call the old copper culture back to roughly 9,500 years ago, with the practice peaking sometime between 7 and 5,000 years ago. The oldest confirmed artifact, a small hunting point hammered out of pure copper, was found beside a lake in Wisconsin and dates to about 8,500 years before now. These weren't people stumbling onto loose nuggets. Excavators have documented pit mines across the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale, worked with fire-setting heating the rock face, then shocking it with cold water until it cracked along its own fault lines. The same technique metalworking cultures on the other side of the planet would arrive at independently. Centuries later, the people who mined this copper were the direct ancestors of the Anishinaabe and Ojibwe communities, who still live around Lake Superior today. That continuity matters because it's the thing. The plaque version of this story quietly leaves out entirely. One particular mass of that copper became something more than raw material. Sitting where the west branch of the Ontonagon River cuts through the Upper Peninsula, a boulder of nearly pure native copper, later weighed at just under 2 tons, had been known to travelers for at least as far back as written records reach. French Jesuit missionaries mentioned it in the 1600s. In 1766, the trader Alexander Henry visited it under Ojibwe guidance and found it so pure he could shave a piece off with a knife. In 1820, the explorer and geologist Henry Schoolcraft surveyed it directly and noted something else. The surface was scarred with chisel and axe marks left by generations of native metal workers, evidence that people had been quarrying pieces from it for a very long time before any American reached the site. To the Ontonagon band of Ojibwe, the rock wasn't simply valuable, it was Misko-biiwaabik, a living spiritual presence, one of the manitous that watched over the land and the people on it. It wasn't for sale in the way a Detroit merchant would. eventually understand that word. If this is the kind of story you'd rather sit with the full weight of than the tidy version, the real transaction, not the highlight reel, you're exactly who this channel is built for. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of the Ontonagon Boulder before today? Here's where the textbook account starts, needing an asterisk. By the time Julius Eldred began pursuing the boulder in earnest, the ground underneath it had already changed hands twice, on paper, without the people living there fully understanding what that paper meant in practice. The 1826 Treaty of Fond du Lac granted the United States government rights to explore and mine minerals across a too-wide OD, a stretch of Ojibwe territory, north of a boundary line. The treaty itself drew. The 1842 Treaty of La Pointe went further, ceding large portions of what's now northern Wisconsin and Michigan's upper, the peninsula outright. Mineral rights, in the language of federal law, now belong to Washington, regardless of what any individual Ojibwe leader might agree to locally. That distinction is the entire hinge of this story, and it's the part almost no version of the plucky merchant narrative bothers to mention. In 1841, Eldred approached Okandikan, the recognized leader of the Ontonagon band, and negotiated directly for the boulder. $45 up front, with more promised if the removal actually succeeded. From where Okandikan stood, this was likely close to a formality. 2 previous attempts by other men to move the rock had already failed outright. It had defeated stronger efforts than a Detroit hardware dealer's. Agreeing to a sale that seemed unlikely to ever be collected on his cost him little and gained his community a genuine payment either way, what Okandikan almost certainly didn't know. Because the treaties negotiating it away had happened in rooms he wasn't in. Was that the mineral rights beneath his own community's land had already been signed over to a government he'd never dealt with directly. He was selling something the United States had already, quietly, decided it also owned. Eldred's first 2 expeditions failed completely, managing only to drag the boulder a short distance on wooden skids before giving up. He came back in August of 1843 with 20 men, a proper capstan, and considerably more patience. The crew winched the boulder up a 50-foot bluff over the course of a full week. They laid a short stretch of railway through the forest, cutting the trees themselves, pushing a single rail car to the end of the line, then pulling up the rails behind it to relay them ahead, over and over, for nearly 4 miles. At the bottom, the boulder went onto a raft and down the river toward the lake. It is, by any honest measure, a genuine feat of 19th-century improvised engineering, executed by people with none of the equipment a mining company would have brought to the same job a decade later. That part of the plaque version is entirely true. It's just not the part that decides who the copper actually belonged to. Eldred put the boulder on display in Detroit that same October, charging $0.25 a head to see it. A fair return, he likely felt, on 16 years of chasing a rumor. He didn't get to keep that return for long. Within a month, the federal government stepped in and laid formal claim to the boulder, citing the very mineral rights those 2 treaties had secured years earlier. Eldred hadn't just bought copper from the wrong seller. He'd bought it from someone who, under American law as Washington now read it, had never fully owned the right to sell it in the first place. The case went to Congress. In 1847, lawmakers authorized a settlement, and Eldred was paid to a little over $5,600, a reasonable sum for his trouble, but not the fortune a national tour might eventually have earned him. The government kept the boulder. What happened to it next tells you almost everything about how seriously 19th-century Washington took the question of where it had actually come from. The Ontonagon Boulder sat in the yard of the Army's Quartermaster's Bureau for roughly 12 years. Not displayed with any ceremony, simply stored, a curiosity on federal property. It moved briefly to the Patent Office before finally being transferred to what would become the Smithsonian Institution around 1860. And it was there, decades later, in the middle of the 1890s, that a writer named Charles Moore, secretary to a sitting U.S. senator, compiled a formal report to the Smithsonian's Board of Regents laying out the boulder's full provenance, the original purchase from Okandikan, the treaties that undercut it, Eldred's repeated attempts, the government's seizure, and the congressional settlement that closed the matter as far as American law was concerned. It is, in its own dry, bureaucratic way, one of the most complete records of exactly how this piece of copper changed hands, forewritten not by the people it was taken from, but by the institution that ended up keeping it. That's the record this story turns on. Not a suppressed account, a published one, sitting in an official archive for well over a century, that most people who've heard the plucky merchant version have simply never read past. Here's what that record makes impossible to ignore, once you actually sit with it. At every single step where a choice was made about who this copper legally belonged to, the person making that choice was not Okandikan, and was not anyone from the Ontonagon band. It was a merchant, then a court, then Congress, then a museum. The nearest thing to Ojibwe consent in the entire chain is a $45 payment made to one leader for one specific boulder, a transaction that, once the treaties are accounted for, may not have been his to make at all, at least not in the way American law would come to insist it was. If you want to see how this kind of dispute gets resolved or doesn't stay through to the end, because this one is still active right now in 2025. The boulder has been on public display at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History for well over a century now, a nearly 2-ton curiosity in the Gem and Mineral Hall, admired by visitors who mostly have no idea it was ever anything other than a striking piece of American mineral wealth. It did not stay uncontested. In 1991, the Keweenaw Bay Indian community formally petitioned the Smithsonian for its return, invoking the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act and arguing that Misko-biiwaabik met the legal definition of a sacred object, a living presence in Ojibwe tradition, not simply an impressive mineral specimen. The Smithsonian's Repatriation Office took the claim seriously enough to investigate it formally. In its 2000 decision, the museum concluded that the evidence submitted didn't establish the boulder as a sacred object under the specific legal standard the law required, leaning, in part, on the same 1,841 payment and the same treaties that had shaped the very first transaction 160 years earlier. The same documents that had once let the federal government claim the boulder from Eldred were now being used to explain why it didn't have to be given back to the people Eldred had bought it from. That decision has not ended the matter. As recently as this past year, local advocates in Michigan's Upper Peninsula have continued publicly pressing the Smithsonian to return the boulder to the Ontonagon region, and the question of what belongs means when the original owner's consent was shaped entirely by treaties they had no real hand in writing, remains exactly as unresolved today as it was in Charles Moore's report from the 1890s. The Smithsonian, for its part, has indicated it intends to eventually give the boulder a permanent, the dedicated exhibit space rather than address the repatriation question further. Depending on where you sit, that's either a reasonable stewardship decision about a genuinely significant mineral specimen, or a quiet way of letting an uncomfortable question stay exactly where it's been for 180 years. Filed, documented, and never quite settled. This isn't a story about a mystery that got solved. The copper's origin was never in question. It came out of the ground on the Ontonagon River, worked by people whose ancestors had been mining that same shoreline for 9,000 years before. Anyone wrote a treaty about it. What's unresolved isn't where the boulder came from. It's whether the paper trail that moved it from a riverbank in Michigan to a display case in Washington ever actually settled the question it claims to have settled, or whether it simply wrote the answer down loudly enough and long enough ago that most people stopped asking. The boulder is still sitting in that museum case tonight, roughly the same weight it was in 1843, scarred with the same axe marks Schoolcraft noted 2 centuries ago, in a building a few miles from the capital where the treaties that first complicated its ownership were once debated and signed. Whatever it is now, mineral specimen, historical artifact, or, as the Ontonagon Band has always maintained, something closer to a living relative, still a long way from home. It has spent longer in federal custody than most of the people who negotiated its removal spent alive. The record from the 1890s answered who bought it, who sold it, and who was compensated when the sale fell apart. It never really answered the only question that still matters.